Hello, Bay Ridge. Welcome to another edition of After Hours. Well, we've kicked off our series in Mark. Last week in After Hours, I covered kind of an introduction to Mark, and on Sunday we looked just at Mark 1:1, which is kind of a preview, a title, kind of a synopsis of the entire Gospel of Mark. And we're looking at this whole series. We're calling it Jesus the King Who Came to Die, where we're going to go through the entire Gospel. But one of the questions would be that there's four Gospels. Why are there four Gospels, and what's the relationship between those four Gospels? Now, what's interesting to note when you go back, we would question and say, well, why four Gospels? Why not just one? But from the earliest records we have in the church, they always recognized that there were these four Gospels and there were, in fact, no others. All of these Gospels were universally accepted by the church from the very earliest days. Some books in the New Testament took a little bit longer to be accepted by everyone, to spread throughout the church. For example, the book of Hebrews was a little bit slower in being accepted in some quarters of the church. But the four Gospels were universally recognized from the very earliest time and records that we have in the church. And furthermore, there were other Gospels. There's a supposed Gospel of Peter. There were different Gospels that were put forth, but they were universally rejected by the church from the very earliest days. So these four, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, were accepted, while the other Gospels that were put forth were rejected by the church, even if they were named after early apostles, like the Gospel of Thomas, one of these Gnostic writings that were there. They were rejected by the early church. And so the early tradition of the church unanimously says four Gospels, no less, no more. Now, they offered a variety of reasons because they kind of thought about this, and some of them said, well, there's the four corners of the earth, or what we would refer to as the four corners of the compass, north, south, east, and west. They already knew at that time that the world was actually round, because you can see an eclipse on the sun. That had been known for a while, but they referred to the four corners of the earth, or what we call the four corners of the compass. And so they said there's four of those, so there's four Gospels. They referred to the four winds of heaven. But the most common reason really came to be because there were four living creatures in the book of Ezekiel. And then later on, that's repeated in the book of Revelation. And so they kind of linked and said, well, there's four of those, and therefore there's four Gospels. There's a variety of reasons given, but everyone agreed there actually were four Gospels, no less, no more. Now, the second thing to note regarding the four Gospels is there are really kind of two groups of Gospels. There are Matthew, Mark, and Luke, which are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels, and then there's John. Now, Matthew, Mark, and Luke are referred to as the Synoptic Gospels. That's a Greek word that means to see together or to see with someone. And they're called this because there's so much in common between Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and they are so very distinct from John. So Mark is the shortest of these three Gospels. It's only about 11,000 words, whereas Matthew is about 18,000 and Luke's a little over 19,000 words. But over 90% of Mark's words have a parallel in Matthew and about 88% in Luke. So very clearly, these three are doing a lot in common. Matthew and Luke are more distinct from one another than either of them are from Mark. Mark is kind of the foundation gospel. I went over last week by most scholars for that reason, and others think it was the earliest of the gospel, of the four Gospels, and that the others kind of used it as a source and they added in additional material. But it's important to note that these Gospels are very similar, and John is very distinct. We'll come to John in just a minute. These Gospels are also similar in that they are full of action and movement. They do have teaching, like Matthew obviously has the Sermon on the Mount, which is a long section of teaching. There are some long sections. Luke 15 is a long section of parables by Jesus. But even though that's the case, they are less than John. John is just huge amounts of teaching by Jesus and much less noting of movement as they go around. And Mark, we're going to see, is the one that is the most full of action, most full of movement, and really the least amount of long discourses and all. So that's the synoptic gospels. And then, as I said, John's a lot different. It contains a lot of material that is not in the synoptic gospels, and they have a lot of actions and words of Jesus that are not in the Gospel of John. And most scholars think that John was written last, and it seems to be written to supplement the synoptics. We have the story that's been told there. John's giving us other information that's important. And as John himself said, all the books in the world couldn't contain everything Jesus said and did and how important it was in unpacking that meaning. So John's just giving additional information that the synoptics didn't have. And it tends to be structured. Each of the Gospels are structured differently. John's structured around a series of sevens. There were 7 I am sayings. There were 7 sign miracles. We've actually done a series covering those, whereas the Synoptic Gospels don't have those. Mark, as I've stated, is topically arranged. It's not really chronological, but each of them are a little bit different, and John is the most distinct. So we have these 4 Gospels because we really need all 4 to get a full picture of who Jesus is, what he said, and what he did. And there's benefit in reading and harmonizing them together, noticing when Mark says something happened versus, when Matthew and Luke cover it, where it's at. Again, Mark's not really chronological, so we can kind of learn some things by doing that. But each of the Gospels stands alone as well. It's important to read and harmonize them, but it's also really important to kind of read them on their own. In our study, we're mainly going to focus just on Mark. We're not going to be trying to harmonize all the time. We're really going to let Mark tell us the gospel story. Let him present to us this king who came to suffer and to die for us. So I again want to remind you, if you have time, try and listen to the whole Gospel of Mark. It'll take you about 80 minutes. But put on an audio Bible and listen to it as you go along, or sit down and take time and read it just to kind of get the whole picture of what Mark is telling us, just to try and take time to do that. If you haven't listened, I'd encourage you to go back and listen to the last After Hours where I talked a little bit about an introduction to Mark. And I'm looking forward to us continuing this journey. We're going to be kind of walking with the disciples, uncovering the most amazing story ever told, the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God, the King who came to die. I hope you have a great week. I look forward to seeing you again this week when we come together to worship the Lord. God bless.